introduction to modeling in Blender. And we'll use a project-based approach here as we cover the basics of modeling, look at commonly used tools, and talk about some time-saving tips and techniques. We'll begin by looking at polygon geometry and learn about its different components. You'll learn how to organize your model into hierarchies and keep your scene clean and efficient. We'll also take a look at multiple modeling tools, including extrude and loop, cut, and slide for adding resolution, inset, and bevel. We'll take a look at using a smoothing or subdivision workflow and use modifiers to help shape our models and work symmetrically. We're going to take a slightly different approach to this introduction course in that we're not going to talk about all of Blender's modeling tools, but rather focus on the tools that you're going to find most useful as you begin the modeling process. Now, once you have a better understanding of how those tools work together, you'll be able to create your own modeling solutions and really come up with a workflow that's comfortable to you. Now, with that, let's go ahead and get started by taking a look at how we can work with objects in Blender. Let's begin by talking about creating simple objects, transforming them around our scene, duplicating those, and we'll also talk about working with the components of our object. So let's jump into Blender here. Now for this course, we're going to be using the version 2.70. And by the time you see this, the newest version may be up to maybe 2.71 at least. So make sure to check out blender.org to see what the latest build is. But for this particular course, we're going to be going with 2.70. So you can see we've got a simple cube here in our 3D view. We've got the tool shelf over on the left-hand side. And then you can see the outliner up here on the top right. This is going to be a list of all the objects within our scene. And right here you can see that we do have a cube right here, and that's what we're looking at. Okay. Right now we're in object mode, so we can select the object overall. To create primitives, we go to the Create tab, and you can see that there's a list of primitives. If I just click on one of these primitives, you can see it gives me right down here the ability to change some of the parameters of that primitive. And you can see it located up here. So we've got now a cylinder and a cube. Now to actually select each one of these objects, we're going to be using the right mouse button. So I can select the cylinder and the cube. Now let's take a look at moving these around. So if I want to move these, you can see right down here below the 3D view port here, you can see there's an option for translate or move, rotate, and scale. And you can see that if I click on those, it brings up the gizmos. That's not the only way to manipulate our objects. For instance, if I want to move this cube around, I can hit the G key on the keyboard, and then with the mouse, I'm not holding down any buttons or anything, I can move it into a new position. So let's say I move it up here and I change my mind and I don't want to actually move it up there. I want to pop it back to where it was. I can just hit the right mouse button. That takes me out of that. Okay, G for grab, basically. I can do the same thing here, hit G, move it around. And one of the things you'll notice is that the mouse actually will wrap around the screen, which is something I really like and something that you don't see in some other applications. And so if you're moving something, you can continue to move it. You don't have to pick up your mouse and move it back over. So you can see how that's wrapping around, and I can move it all the way off screen if I want. So if I want to, keep it right where it is, I like where I've placed it, I can use the left mouse button, and that'll actually place that in position. Okay. Let's say we've still got this selected. Let's say we now want to rotate this. We can hit the R key, and that'll rotate that around a little bit. And we can decide that we like that. We can hit the S key, and that will allow us to scale. I'm not hitting any mouse buttons. I'm just hitting the key and then moving the mouse. Okay. Let's select the cylinder. And so let's say we want to move this along a particular axis. So we can hit the G key, and then we can hit the X key, and we can move it along just the X-axis. And so I just tapped it. We can also, again, hit G. This time we'll hit Z, and we can move it just straight up and down. So there is a way to constrain the movement to a particular axis. In addition to that, we can also come down here and use the manipulators themselves, which if you're coming from another application, maybe is a little bit more familiar to you. And you can actually grab a particular handle and move it along a particular axis. And same thing here, we can kind of pull this down and resize it that way. All right, so if you want to duplicate an object, we can hit Shift D and then just move our mouse off. We can also constrain that, so if we want to just make a new copy along the X-axis, we can do that, and then we can come back in here, manipulate that however we want. So Shift D will allow you to do that. You can also add new objects, so you can either hit Add from down here, and you can come in here, and there's lots of different kinds of objects that you can add. The meshes you can come in here and add as well. In addition, you can also hit Shift A to bring up add, and then you can add meshes from there. So I can add a new cone. And you can see that this is added it actually as a new object, and that's important, something we'll talk about here in a second. So up to this point, we've just been working with objects as a whole, but let's say we want to now come in and work with the different components of an object. So these objects, and we'll talk about more about components in the next lesson, but basically I want to be able to change the shape using the different building blocks of these objects. So we want to come out of object mode and go to edit mode, and we can do that here, or we can also hit the tab key to do that. And then we're able to select 3 different component types. So we've got the polygon faces, the edges, or the points, and you can see there's kind of a filter down here on what we're able to actually select. We can also hit, let's see, I think it's Control Tab. Actually, Control Tab, and you can actually bring up, if you want to really quickly choose, well, I want to just be able to grab the points or the edges of the faces, you can do that too. Okay, and then you can come in and select whatever component that you have chosen and move it around if you want to. Okay, you can always go back into object mode. Now, keep in mind if you are in edit mode, so we're in edit mode here, we can deselect or select all by hitting the A key to kind of toggle that through. But let's say we're in edit mode with a particular object, in this case the cone, and we go to add, so I'll hit Shift A, and I want to add a cube to this. So what's happened is you can see the new cube has been added, but it's actually been added as part of that same object. So you can see it's still part of that cone. So there may be cases where you want to have multiple objects within a single polygon object here. You can add those objects while you're in edit mode. Otherwise, if you add an object in object mode, it's going to create a new object if you add a new mesh. Okay, so the next thing that we are going to talk about is actually the kind of the components that we just briefly touched on. So we'll talk about the basics of working with polygons, kind of what they're constructed of, and some of the kind of concepts behind working with polygon objects. Now let's talk about polygons specifically and kind of the building blocks that make up those polygon objects. So let's jump back into Blender. And this just has a couple of example files that are really, really simple. This is 03 begin if you want to open this up, but you don't have to. But what we have here is just a simple cube. And one thing that I did want to mention that I kind of forgot to mention in the last lesson was you see this little kind of cursor that jumps around here. This is our 3D cursor, and I'm just using the left mouse button, and wherever I click, it places that cursor. Wherever this cursor is, that's where your new primitive object is going to be created. So you can see here now it's off of the origin. So now if I were to go in and create another cube, that cube is going to be placed at that origin, or at that 3D cursor rather. If you want to move that 3D cursor back here, you can just hit Shift C, and that'll move it right back to the origin. So I just wanted to mention that's important when you're creating your primitives. So as we kind of talked about in the last lesson, you know, having an object like this cube is not really all that useful unless you are needing just a cube. If you want to actually start to kind of make different shapes and, you know, pull the object into kind of a different configuration or add arms or really just change it from the shape of a cube, you're going to want to deal with the building blocks of this polygon cube. So let's take a look at exactly what those are. So to do that, we're going to have to go into edit mode. So I'm just going to hit tab, and you'll see here, as we talked about, there are points. Each point can be called a vertex as well, or the plural is vertices. And so you can also access edges or polygon faces, which are actually the visible portion of the geometry. And you can see when we click on faces and highlight that, we get this little tick in the center of each face. So in order to select the different components, we can right-click on those. So I can click on points, and you can see with move on, you can actually grab and move those around. Okay, so I can grab those points, or by using Shift, you can grab a different selection of points. So if you wanted to grab all the points on top, you can also select edges. So you can go through here and highlight edges, and we can move those around as well. In addition, we can select the actual faces. Now, whichever one of these we're on, if we hit A with something selected, it'll deselect it. If we hit it again, it'll actually select everything. And so that can be useful if you're trying to, If you've got a selection and you want to deselect it, A will do that, and if you hit it again, it'll actually select all those components that you currently have selected. So let's deselect those, and let's talk about some of the different kinds of polygon faces that we can deal with. Okay, so I'm going to go back into object mode, and I'm going to turn off this cube. Let's turn on this second one, and we'll select this cube. So right now it looks identical to the other cube, right? But let's take a look at the configuration of the components. So we'll go back into edit mode, and you can see that there are different types of polygon faces on this cube. Okay, and they're going to be defined by the number of sides that the polygon has. So this face on the side has 1, 2, 3, 4 sides. So that's a very common type, the most common type, and the one that we want to try to build our models with. Okay, it's also called a quad. You might hear that term. If we look up here on the front, you can see that this quad has been subdivided into 2 triangles. Okay, so these will be called triangles or tris. It's kind of the smallest face that you can have. It's got 3 edges. Okay, and in the end, it's going to be kind of broken down into those triangles, but for models that are going to be smoothed or subdivided or animated, a lot of times we'll want to make sure to build our models using quads with maybe a few tris built into it. If you're working in a game engine, okay, a lot of times your topology can be optimized using triangles to get the result that you want. So again, up here in the top, we've got, and here on the side as well, we've got some other types. So if we take a look at these, some of these are a little bit harder to tell what it is. This actually looks like a triangle, but actually it's a quad. You can count the edges, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Here's a quad. This is a triangle. But if we take a look on the side, this looks like a quad, but this is actually something called an n-gon, n-gon. And that just means that this is a polygon and the number of sides are 5 or over. So it's not a quad, it's not a tri, it's anything over a quad as far as the number of sides go. Even though it looks like a quad, you've got this line terminating at the side here. Now oftentimes you'll have things like the caps on a cylinder. If you don't have any tessellation across that, it could be an n-gon. So just think of that, an n-gon as a polygon with 5 or more sides. Okay, we want to usually get rid of those and not have those in our models as a general rule. All right, let's go back to object mode and let's take a look at these cylinders. We'll talk a little bit about kind of the idea behind polygons. So if we take a look at these 2 cylinders, you can see they're both sort of the same shape, but this one looks very faceted and this one looks a lot smoother. That's because of the nature of polygons, where we've got straight lines between the points that we're working with. Okay, so the points that we use to make up this polygon, the edges consist of straight lines between those, so there's no curvature between that. So that means that if we want to get a nice curved surface using a polygon object, we need to have a lot of polygons. So here, this one actually has 8 polygons, which is very light and easy to deal with. The problem is that when we look at it from here, it doesn't look really that smooth. When we look at this one, well, that looks much smoother. The trade-off is that we're working with a lot more polygons. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Now, when you work with a smoothing workflow, as we're going to be talking about in the next lesson, that becomes less important because it's something where you can work with a low resolution mesh and then smooth it at render time. Then you can work with a low number of polygons and only deal with a large polygon count to get your smooth surface at the very end when it calculates the render. But that is something to think about when you're working with polygons. It's, you got to think about the trade-off between the smoothness of the object and how many polygons you're actually going to be working with. Now let's real quickly just touch on some of the basic tools that we're going to be using. So if we go into edit mode, selecting this object here, we can select a face, and extruding is going to be a big thing. So we can do is hit Alt-E, and then there are different types of extrudes. I'm just going to hit region, vertex, normal, and I can pull this geometry out. So that's one way that we can go about adding geometry. We can also come in here and go to tools, and you can find lots of different tools located in here. Okay, let's deselect that. If we use the knife, we can manually add edges across the surface, which is really cool. We can subdivide it that way. Loop, cut, and slide will allow us to add edges over here. And on any of these also, if you come over here and kind of hover over it, you can see the shortcut. So for this one, it's Control R. For the knife, it's K. So if I use that, come in here, it kind of gives you a preview of where that's going to be located. So I'll click once, and then I can slide it up and down and add that edge loop wherever I want it. That's going to become very important when we talk about smoothing. All right, so those are a few of the tools that we're going to be using, and throughout this process, we're going to be using those in more of in context as we build our project, so don't worry about that. So the next thing that we're going to be talking about is the idea of smoothing geometry. We talked about polygons. Let's talk now about the idea that we can build our geometry as sort of a low res and then smooth it to get a nice smooth surface. So let's talk about that next. In this lesson, we'll talk about a smoothing workflow. So when we talk about a smoothing workflow, you can see here we've just got our simple cube. We talked about working with polygons and that they're kind of easy to move around and manipulate, but oftentimes in order to get the smoothness that we would want on a particular model, you need lots and lots of polygons. So that's where a smoothing workflow or subdivision surface workflow comes in really, really handy. So the idea here is that we can build our meshes using relatively low resolution geometry, enough that we're able to rig and animate and move it around. But then we can apply a subdivision algorithm to this mesh to create nice smooth surfaces where we want them. And then also we'll need to build in the sharpness of the edges where we want those as well. So in order to do this here in Blender, one of the ways we can do it here is just to select our cube. So we've got it selected, and then right over here, our properties, you can see there's a little wrench button right here. So we're looking at our object, and then here's our wrench. And so what we can do here is add a modifier. So the modifier that we want to add, if we come in here, is going to be the subdivision surface modifier. So subsurf. So let's go ahead and add that, and you can see right away it kind of subdivides it. So each face now is 4 faces, and it also smooths out the shape. So it makes it actually into a little bit more of a ball shape. So inside of this modifier, you can see we can turn the effect of that modifier on or off if we want to. Okay, so it's very flexible. You can come in and change this if you want to, or if you wanted to get rid of it, you could go ahead and just delete it. Now, these are the algorithms that you can use. You can use the simple subdivision, or we can use the Catmull-Clark smoothing, which we'll use right now. Now, the subdivisions are listed right down here. So in the view, it's subdividing it once, and then actually can separate this out so that when you render this, it'll actually subdivide it a little bit more. So we're just working here in the view. So let's take a look at what happens here if we increase this. So we can take this up to 2, and you can see it's basically taking this and then subdividing it again. So each one of these faces now becomes 4 faces, and the resulting points are smoothed. So you can see if I take this up and up, we end up with a really smooth surface. Okay. Now if we come in here and we try to manipulate this, so let me take this down to maybe 4, let's say. And so we've got our object here. We can move it around just as we would. Let's go back into edit mode. You can see we don't see the points for the sphere. We see the points for the cube that the sphere is being calculated from. So we can still model using these points, but the surface that we get will be a result of our smoothing subdivision modifier. So if I were to come in here and let's extrude this out, you can see that we're able to work with very low resolution, but we can come in here and start to manipulate this. Now, there are things to be aware of. You can see where we have this sharp corner here. This is very smooth because the smoothing is taking place between this edge, and this edge, which are very far apart. So you get a very smooth surface. If you want a very tight surface, you just need to make sure to add edges. So Control R will allow us to bring in a new edge. And if I pull this down into the corner, you can see it serves to kind of tighten that up. Let's do it again from this direction. You can see now we've got these 3 edges that it's smoothing between, and now we get a much tighter circle. In the same way, you can see here where at the ends, it's very smooth here. If I wanted to create more of a tight cylinder shape, again, I would want to add an edge coming this way, and you can see as I pull it closer, it tightens that up, and it's a very quick and intuitive feedback that you get as you go through and model this way. Okay, and this is a very common way of working with and building geometry. You're working with your polygons, but you know in the end that you're going to be smoothing it or subdividing it, and you can add a subsurf modifier to be able to see the result of that smoothing as you model. Now, this works great with quads, very predictable, but you also need to make sure to either crease your model or add edges. If you add actual edges into your model, that makes it very, very portable. You're able to take that into any other application and you're going to get a predictable result versus trying to use proprietary creasing in some other applications, although that is possible. So at any time, we've created this geometry. At any time, remember these settings. If we were to delete this and then go back in and add it again, we'll get still a predictable result if we were to go back up to the same level of subdivision because it's based on those same polygons. Now, if you want to have your model not have this modifier anymore, you actually just want to bake it down into these points, all you have to do is hit apply. Oops. And you want to make sure you're not in edit mode. There we go. And hit apply. And now you can see we don't have any modifiers and the object still looks the same. We've gotten rid of that low poly cage, which may or may not be what we want. So now if we come in here and go to edit mode, you can see, whoa, we've got lots of points. Let's bake down the result of that modifier. So now if you wanted to change something, you would need to come in and figure out how to modify this while keeping the smooth surface. So just be careful of that. Applying that modifier will bake down the result of your subdivision, whatever level it happened to be at. All right, so we're going to be working this way when we build our little robot toy. We're going to be using a smoothing subdivision type of workflow. So you'll get more used to that as we go along. So the next thing that we want to do is to talk a little bit about kind of hierarchy and workflow and kind of where things are located. And then we'll take a kind of an overview of the project we're going to be working on before we start to add some background images. So let's go ahead and take a look at hierarchy and workflow in the next lesson. In this lesson, we'll talk about hierarchy and workflow in Blender. So we'll start to get a bunch of objects here in your Blender scenes. You're going to want to kind of keep these objects named appropriately. You're also going to want to start to organize those into a hierarchy. So you have different objects that are going to be associated with each other. You're going to want to be able to see those over here in the outliner and have that make sense, and also be able to kind of move those around and work with those in a way that makes sense for you in the 3D view. So a few things to keep in mind. We want to start to make sure that we name our objects, and we can do that over here in our outliner up at the top right-hand view. You can see here that if we click on this little button, you can choose all these different types of interfaces here, or windows. And so we're here in the outliner, which is what we're working with. So it's just basically a list of all the things in our scene. So you can see here the little triangle represents our geometry. So we have this cone, a cube, another cube with an extension on the end, a sphere, and then we have Suzanne the monkey. So we can access those here. If you want to rename something, all we have to do is either right click and go to rename, or we can just double click on the name here and we can call this something that makes a little bit more sense to us. If we can come in here and say, this is, go down to rename, miscellaneous piece A, whatever our naming convention is, we can come in here and start to name these things. Okay, we can also start to create parent-child relationships. So you could parent one object to another if you wanted them to be included. So let's say we wanted this cube to be, this building to be the parent, and then maybe some of these other objects here. We can select the object, and then I'm just going to, let's select this one, then I'll shift select this cube, and I'm just going to hit Control P. It's going to bring up this parenting window, and we'll just say set parent to object. So now when we select the cube, you can see that the cone follows along with it, this miscellaneous piece A. And you can see that if I expand this building down, this is actually located underneath. Now, one of the cool things we can do here is just simply grab this and we can move it out. Oops, I'm going to do that. Grab this one, and I can move it out, and I can drop it to either clear the parent, or I can set it to a new parent. So if I just want to pull it out from under the building, I can just pull it out here, and then it's dropped out side there. So there it is right there. Okay. Alternatively, if you want to create a parent relationship using that method, you could just grab it, and as we looked at, bring it up. Let me grab it. And then drop it onto the building, drop to set parent, and it does the same thing. Now, there are different ways of parenting as far as the transforms go, but that's one way to do it. Okay, we can also come in here, if we don't want to have one model be a parent, we can also create an empty, and it drops it in right where our 3D cursor is. So I'm going to hit Shift-C to put that cursor right in the middle. Let's create our empty, and then we can use that. We can say, okay, that's going to be our main group, and then we can start to drop these pieces underneath this main group, so that the parent isn't actually a piece of geometry, it's an empty or a locator, if you want to call it that, a null object, and that's going to be the top of your group. So you can start to organize things that way, and it just helps especially when you have a scene with a lot of different objects in it. You want to have things organized. Now you can also group things by actually creating a group. And so, for instance, if I wanted to grab maybe a few of these things, I'll just hit Control-G to group those together. And let's call this group just temp group. And so I can still come in and access all of these separately. Okay. Or if I want to select all the members of a group, I can I'll select one, hit Shift-G, and then I can choose to select the entire group. And so that'll allow me to select everything. You don't see that over here in the outliner, but you do have the ability to organize. So if you want to be able to select a bunch of different things at once, you can use that. You can use a group for that. Okay. You can also come in here and see the groups over here. Okay. In your properties there. Okay, a couple other things in the outliner. You can also turn off the visibility of your objects. You can also turn off their ability to be selected. So can't select that. You can also turn off their ability to be rendered. So visibility, ability to be selected, and the renderability of it. So you can turn all that off here in our outliner as well. Okay, and you can do some filtering there. This basically just contains all the information in your scene as we looked at. So make sure to as you go through the process of building your geometry, make sure to name your objects so they mean something. So you're not just looking at 10 different cubes and you have to go through and cycle through and select them all to see which one is which. You want to be able to name it so you know exactly what you're selecting when you do that, and also organize it into a hierarchy that makes sense. So if you have smaller groups that are contained with larger groups, you can use empties to organize those, or you can just use geometry as parents if you want to. I'd probably recommend using an empty as the top level of your different groups, especially the top group, but it's up to you and the pipeline that you're working with. So now that we've looked at kind of the hierarchy and workflow and took a look at using the outliner, well, let's, in the next lesson, take a look at the little project that we're going to be working with and kind of explain how it is we'll go through that process. So let's do that next. In this lesson, we'll take a look at our little robot that we'll be using for the project for this intro to modeling. So let's jump into Blender. This is 06 Begin, and you can see this is the little character that we're going to be creating. It's pretty simple, but even if you haven't done any modeling at all, you'll be able to go through this with no problem and build this little guy up. Now, you can see we'll talk about some of the different parts of him, but I want to just mention that it's not that important that yours look exactly like mine. The key really is that you learn the tools that we're using and why we're using those and how we're getting the shapes that we're getting. If you want to make yours a little bit more customized and create some different kinds of shapes, feel free to do that, please. We'd love to see what you do with that, and feel free to make it your own. The key really is that you absorb kind of the information of each particular lesson, not necessarily that your points are in exactly the same spot as mine. Okay, so just keep that in mind as you go through it. Don't stress about making it look exactly like the one that we're doing. Just really make sure that you understand the concepts and apply it to whatever it is that you want to do as far as the shape that you make. But let's go ahead and take a look at this guy. He's made a very simple shape. So you can see here, like for instance on the body, we're able to get some nice smooth lines here in combination with some sharp edges. Okay, and if we take a look at this, we've got it selected here. We go over and take a look at the modifier. You can see that we actually have a sub-surf modifier on here. So you can see the geometry looks like that until we smooth it, and then it looks like that. So we need to make sure to know how, where to place the edges so that we get the result that we want. We get this nice, smooth, raised area on the back. Well, how do we make our low polygon model look like? What do we need to make it look like in order to get that result when we add our smoothing modifier? Okay, that's one of the things that we'll talk about. How to also go in and create these sort of insets and figure out what's which part's going to be sharp versus which part's going to be very smooth. Like you see a sharp corner here and a smooth edge, a smooth corner over here. How do we know that that's going to happen beforehand? That's a big part of learning to model, is kind of anticipating what's going to happen when you add that smoothing modifier. We'll talk about going in to some of these pieces and sort of adding little bends to the objects. We'll also talk about working symmetrically. So if you take a look at this head, you can see we actually have a mirror modifier that's loaded onto this. And so if I turn this off, you can see we're actually only working with half. And so we're really trying to narrow down what it is that we're working on. So if we're only working on half the head, we don't have to worry about the other side. We know that whatever we create here, we'll be able to make an exact symmetrical copy of it by using our mirror modifier. And you can see we can have multiple modifiers. We also have the smoothing on here as well. You can see that that head looks like a cube until we smooth it. And now the front's flat, but the back is round. Why is that happening? What did we do to the model to make it do that? Okay, we did it very purposefully, and we'll show you, where to add those edges and how to make that happen. Okay, so that when you smooth it, you know exactly what's going to happen. We also came in and were able to create these sort of antenna here. You can do that in a couple of different ways. You can see we've got these cutouts for the head and these sort of seams going down the head, some pipes coming in here, also the legs and the feet. And you can see we've got mirror images of those, and so working symmetrically is going to be really important for us on this project. Okay, so again, very simple model. If you want to get more complex with it, if you feel more comfortable as we go through this process, you're kind of like, yeah, I really get it, then go to town and feel free to kind of make it your own and add all the little details that you want. But for our base project, we're going to be going with something like this. Okay, so let's go ahead and in the next lesson, take a look at how we can start to add background images into our Blender scenes to kind of help us as a guide when we're beginning to build our models. So let's do that next. In this lesson, we'll learn to add background images to our scenes in Blender. So why would we want to add a background image into our 3D view in Blender? Let's start by kind of minimizing our perspective view and take a look at some of the other orthographic views that we can use when we model. So I'm going to hit Control-Alt-Q, and you can see that brings up 4 different views: top, front, and right. If you've done any sort of 3D and other applications, these are familiar to you. But the key is you're looking at different views of your model. So looking at it from the top, from the front, from the right. You can see we've got a cube, so it pretty much looks the same in any view. But if you've got something more complex, it's obviously going to look different from a different aspect. And so if we have guide images in each one of these, or at least 2 of these views, that can help us when we're building our model. So we want to build the robot's head. We know what it should look like from the side because we have an image of it in here, and also from the front. If we have 2 or more kind of frames of reference, it helps us to get those points in the right spot, match up the object that we're trying to create. In addition, it also helps us as we're going through tutorials together, because we don't have to concentrate so much on matching specific points and putting edges exactly in the same spots. If we're working with the same images, that we kind of take that out of the equation a little bit. So you know where to put the points because you can see it on the screen. You can concentrate a little bit more on actually the tools and the topics that we're talking about. We don't have to worry so much about the nuts and bolts of trying to get the points in exactly the right spot. So it helps in that way too. And so let's take a look at how we can start to add images to the different views here in Blender. So the first thing that we want to do is bring up the property shelf, and we can do that by using this little arrow up here. I'm sorry, the little plus sign up here, or we can hit the N key on our keyboard, and we're going to come all the way down to the bottom, and you'll see there's an area for background images. Let's go ahead and roll that out. I'm going to turn it on. So the first thing we want to do is add an image. So let's go to Add Image. That's going to add this little section down here for a particular image. Each image that we create will have its own little area. So we want to open an image from our hard drive or network drive, whatever it is. And so we'll go to Open. And then let's navigate to the place where images are going to live. And so the images that I'm going to use are in our project files. So let's go into those project files and go to the Referenced Files folder. And let's just grab the robot front to begin with. So go ahead and say open that image. Now you can see initially that this robot front is appearing in every view, which doesn't really help us that much because it's not really going to look like that in every view, obviously. So if we come down here, you can see now we've got a lot more information that we can change here that has to do with our robot front. So the first thing we'll notice here, it says under Access All Views. Now we don't really want it to appear in all views. We want it to appear in the appropriate view, which in this case is the front view. So we'll change this all views. We'll click on this and let's just choose front. So now you can see it disappears everywhere but the front view. Now let's kind of take a look at it here. So you can see here we have this sort of grayed out version of the image and the geometry sitting on top of it. So we can kind of use it as a guide when we're creating, the different parts of this robot. And you can change the opacity of it, so make it invisible practically, or you can make it completely opaque. Usually when we're working with images like this, we want them to be at least under 50% opacity. You just want to be able to make out the shape, but you don't want it to overpower the geometry that you're working with. Also, in this case, it might be good to turn on front. That way we can see the image over the top of our shaded geometry. In addition, you can also choose to work in wireframe and be able to see it that way. All right. You can also change the size and positioning here, but we'll leave this alone for now. All right, so we've got one image loaded up in our front view. So the next thing that we want to do is load up some more images. Let's go ahead and load up an image. And so we'll go back we'll add image, and then go to open once again. Let's go back into our reference files and let's choose the side view. Let's do the same thing here with this side view. Let's choose front and let's change our axis to the right. You can see it was kind of overlapping with that image there, and we don't really want that. Now, if you want to, you can move those around as we talked about. So in this case, the bottom, or he's kind of existing right in the middle of our grid. Let's say we wanted him to stand kind of on the top here. So for instance, we're looking at the right-hand view or the side view. We could come in and you can see there's only two ways to change the position. That's because we're looking at the orthographic view. We're not going to be pushing it, away from us and towards us. And so if we click on this, we can kind of move this up a little bit so he's standing right on top. And if we go back to the front view, we can do the same sort of thing. So here you can see I can add that same value in there, and that way they'll both continue to match up. So I've just moved them 3.8, and so they're kind of standing right on top of the grid now. Okay, assuming that we build it to this image, our model would be standing kind of on top of the grid. All right, so that's a look at adding background images. You can always come in here and either replace those or delete them if you want. You can turn off the visibility of each one, or you can turn off the visibility of all of them at once just by clicking the little check there. Okay, but they can be really useful, especially when you're starting out, or if you just need to match something up exactly. Having those images in there can be a big help, and those can be added that way. So the next thing we'll do is go ahead and begin to block in the body of our robot. So let's go ahead and do that next. Now let's begin to block in the body for our robot character. So here we have just a basic cube, default cube loaded up, and we've got our images loaded in. So the first thing we might want to do is just position it appropriately. So let's make sure we're in edit mode, and then I'm just gonna go ahead and move this cube. Let's select it. I just want to move it up to the body, and so we can look here in the front view to get an idea of where it needs to go. Also in the side view, you can see it matches up pretty well, hits the neck on the same spot. And let's go into scale this. I'm just going to scale it in a little bit to match up with the shape that I see here. Scale it down in the Z as well. I think it doesn't have to be exact. Let's scale it in the Y a little bit. so that it matches up with the shape that we've got there. You may need to move it back or forward a little in the Y. And now it should be in the right spot because you can see it's in the right spot according to the right-hand view and according to the front, so we should be good to go. Now, if we want to create or change the shape of this, we're going to need to add more resolution. Now, I also want to use a mirror modifier to be able to just model one side of the model and have it automatically mirrored over to the other. So we'll need to add some extra geometry. So let's come up here. And if this is still set to a camera view, just hit 5 a couple of times and you can set that back to your user perspective. All right, so to change the shape, we're going to want to go to edit mode, so we can hit tab to do that. Now I want to split right down the middle, so Control R is going to let us do that, or you can choose loop, cut, and slide from on the left-hand side here. So Control R, and I want it to be right in the middle. You can see as I'm hovering over, it's giving me a kind of a preview. As soon as I click the left mouse button, it's going to let me slide that around the surface. So I want to go ahead and just double click, just so it's right at the center. All right, so now that we've got that, I'm going to go ahead and delete one side of this. So we'll choose polygons. I'm just going to use Control and drag across. Now, if I just do this right now, it's not going to actually select all the way through. And so let's change to a wireframe, and then we'll do the same thing. Control left mouse button, and I'll just draw a lasso across there. You can see it selects all of those. We'll hit X, and then we'll choose to delete the faces. Okay, so I've deleted that side. If you want to delete the other side, you can certainly do that too. Okay, so now we want to kind of create that other side using a modifier instead. So we've got the cube selected. Let's go back to object mode, and we're going to come over to this little wrench right here. Okay, let's choose add modifier, and let's choose a mirror modifier. Now, I've got it set to X right now, merge is on, just the default settings, and you can see that it works quite well. Now I want to add some resolution here to define not only the shape of the leg, but also this hole. So that's something else that we need to add. We'll go back to edit mode. Now we'll hit Control R once again. Let's click here, and then we'll just drag it into the right spot. So I'm not pushing any buttons, it's just letting me come in and position this. So I think right here is a good spot to put that. Okay, now we also need one kind of going the other way as well. So Control R, and let's add one going this way, kind of right in there. And you can see it's starting to add that resolution to our cube. Let's also add another modifier here. Let's start to see what this looks like as a smooth surface. So we can add more than one modifier. We've got the mirror already. Let's add a subsurface modifier, so subdivision surface. And you can see the result of that there. Okay, let's go down to our subsurface, and let's just increase that amount just a little bit. Now you can see the smoothing on the front is what we want, but on the back, we don't want it to be that smooth. So if we think about it, why is it that smooth? That's because there's not a lot of resolution in here. So let's start to add some resolution. So the first thing that I want to do is we want to have kind of an opening here for the neck. And so let's add a couple of lines right in here. And I'll do the same thing kind of back here. So something like that. So just adding that resolution, it really kind of tightens up that shape. In this case, I think it's tightened it up a little bit too much. So let's come in and begin to shape this a little bit. So we'll add one more right in here, and it actually, you can see, makes it really sharp. But if we go into wireframe here, and I want to go to points, let's drop everything by hitting the A key, Control left mouse across there, and let's begin to kind of pull this down a little bit. So we can begin to pull that shape down. We'll do the same thing here and here. We can kind of create that rounded shape. Now, as far as this back part back here goes, I can bring this down a little bit and in. So you can see, even though I'm moving the low-res points, what I'm looking at really is this smooth version here. I'm trying to match that up because that's our final shape, and so that's what we want to try to match up. All right. Now I also want to bring the leg up a little bit. And so let's, from the front view, grab that, and it's going to grab it all the way through. And we'll just kind of pull this up a little bit. And this time I am looking at that bottom part. You can see it's very, very soft down at the bottom. So let's go back, Control R, tighten that up by adding another edge down there. So we can kind of pull this down, and it really serves to kind of tighten that up. Let's go back to solid and see what this looks like. So you can see how we're starting to get the shape of the body that we want. You can see the low resolution cage and the smoothed result. Now the great thing is that to create this final shape, all we're really working with is half the model, and we're working with it at a very low resolution. So it makes our lives much easier because we don't have a lot of polygons to think about. Even though there's a lot of polygons involved in making this smooth shape, the computer and Blender is doing a lot of it for us. So that's really nice. So the next thing that we'll do is go ahead and create some kind of beveled corners and just generally add a little bit more detail, insets and things like that to the model. So let's go ahead and do that next. Now let's continue adding some detail to the body. So one thing that I know that I want to add is kind of a bevel along this edge of the shape. So coming along here, we want to have kind of a flattened piece. If we take a look at our artwork, you can kind of see that edge there. So if we want to bevel this, what we can do is select the edges. So we want to make sure that we're in edit mode, and we'll go to an edge selection. And let's come in here and actually just select the specific edges that we want. So I'm going to select these coming across here, all the way down. Now if we want to create a bevel, quick way to do that is hit Control B, and then you can see the little line there. So I'm going to just drag, and you can see as I drag, you can see that bevel get larger and smaller. So I'm going to kind of, in this case, look more at the cage to see my bevel width, because you're not really seeing too much in the smooth version. It's just kind of sharpening up a little bit. And so I think something like that will be good. And we'll click to end that bevel. Now, whenever we do a bevel like this, it's good to be aware of what's actually happening. So you can see that this edge has been replaced by a strip of polygons. But one thing that might not be so apparent is what's happened down here at the bottom. So down here at the bottom, you can see where we had a quad because we had a point right here. That's now split. And so we do have n-gons down here at the bottom, here and here. So just something to be aware of. Whenever you do something on one part of the model, sometimes it can affect other areas of the model, and you just want to, as a modeler, be aware of what's going on there at all times. So the next thing we'll do, I'm going to go ahead and drop out of that. I want to add resolution in here so that we can begin to add in this little opening here. So I'm going to hit Control R. Let's add one right in here, right along this edge. Okay, now let's take a look at the sharpness overall. So I want to really sharpen up where I've just beveled. So I'm going to use Control R, and the edges that I'm going to add now are kind of like what we did with the back. They're just going to be to tighten up the subdivision surface. So sometimes you'll hear those referred to as like support edges maybe. And so I'll just hit Control R, and I'm going to click and drag one kind of right up in here. And let's do the same thing down here. So you can see as we get those edges closer to another edge, it creates a little bit of a sharper shape. So if we go to object mode, we can kind of see what that actually looks like. So we get a nice beveled shape there. All right, let's now, let's go back to edit mode. And I want to create an inset for the legs. So let's do that by selecting those polygons. So I'll just shift select just the polygons on this part that's kind of angled up. And now I want to do an inset. So I want to extrude the polygons, but I don't want them to come in or out. So I'm going to hit I on the keyboard, and that'll allow me to inset these polygons a little bit. Now you can see there's a little bit of overlap in the corners. If I go ahead and click on that, you can come over here to the left-hand side and you can change some of the values of what you've just done. So I don't want to select outer. So I'll turn that off. That gives me select inner. And then you can come in and you can change the thickness values and so forth on some of these things that you're doing. All right. So let's leave that as it is. So something like that. You can see here we're getting some overlapping on these points right up in here. So let's drop out of that. we'll go back to points. And then if you want to, now we'll need to, these are n-gons anyway. And so one of the things that we can do is start to combine some of these points together. And so let's take a couple of these points. And I'm just going to select those. Now if we go down to mesh, right down here, we can access some tools that are specific to faces, edges, and vertices. So you can also bring up those specific menus using Control F for faces, Control E for edges, and Control V for vertices. So if we go to vertices and say, let's go up to merge, you can see the hotkey for that is actually Alt M. So if we click on merge, you can see it gives us an option of where we want to actually merge those. We'll just say at center. And so it's merged those now back into one point. Let's do the same thing here. And so let me select those. Make sure I don't have anything else selected. This time we'll just hit Alt M and we'll say at center. Now we don't have to do, actually we do have to do the other side because it's front and back. We don't have to do the other side though. So let's drop out of that. We'll select these, Alt M. Oops, not Control M, Alt M. Let me undo that. There we go, and we'll say at center. And then we'll do the same thing down here. At center. All right. Now we want to still connect this up because right now we have a quad here, but we have these n-gons. And even though this is going to be hidden, I don't want to have any n-gons on the geometry. So one of the things we could do is use the knife. So let's just use K for knife. We'll click on this point, click here, and we'll just draw this all the way across. Oops, let me finish that again. There we go. And just hit enter to complete that. Now, we still have an n-gon here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's do the same thing again. K to use the knife, and we'll just draw this across. Okay, and that gives us nice clean geometry at the bottom. Now we still need to create the inset or the opening there. So let's go ahead and click on this geometry. Now I really want a tight edge around this, so I'm going to do another short inset. So and do a real short one, just like that. Now what we can do is actually extrude in. So I can just hit E to extrude and begin to push that into the surface. If I click on that, you can see I can come in here and change these values in here for the extrude. You can also turn off your subsurface to kind of see what that actually is looking like. So you can see there, I can go ahead and continue to kind of push that in a little bit to make it a little bit more drastic. I can also use Control R to come in and add some edges right in here just to make sure that those edges are really well defined. Let's turn on our subsurface modifier, and there you can see we get that nice little inset. If we go back to object mode, we can see it much more clearly. And you can see it mirrored over on the other side as well. All right, so once we've got that, the next thing we want to do is create our inset on the front and for the top neck opening. So let's go ahead and do that next. In this lesson, we'll try to finish up the body of our little robot. So we want to add this little inset detail on the front. And so you can see we have a polygon sort of defining that area. So that's the one we'll use. I'm going to turn off temporarily the visibility of our smoothing. And let's select that particular face. All right, now before we extrude in, we know that in order to create a nice sharp edge when we smooth this, that we want to have edges along the corners. So if we just extrude this in, we're not going to get that edge that's up on the top there. So what we can do is do a really quick inset before we do our extrude. So I'll hit I, and I just want to bring this down just like that. So just so you get a little rim around the side. And if you've got that rim selected, you can come over here and make sure that select outer is turned off. Now we can hit E to extrude, and we can extrude that in. Okay, so just doing that first saves you a little bit of time because otherwise you'd have to go back in and draw those out. and it would take a little bit longer. Let's also hit S to sort of scale this down a little bit. Let's jump back over here, and I'm just going to move it up and maybe over just a little bit. All right. Now you can see the smoothness that we've got there on the edges. And so let's see what this looks like if we turn back our subsurf back on. So we do have a tight edge around here, but you can see that it's really, really rounded off, which is not really what we want. As you can see here, if we match this up, you can see this corner looks okay, but these two, and especially this one, much too soft. And so let's go ahead and add, oops, there we go. Let's add some edge loops here. So I'm going to hit Control R, and we'll add one right in here. And I'm just going to pull it over, kind of right in there. Okay, so that kind of tightens up that edge. Now we don't want this edge to be quite so tight, so let's do another one. And we'll add that kind of right in here until we get something like that. Okay, now if you want to soften up any of those edges, you can come in, and if you remember, when we select points, let me just drop everything. When we select points and move them away, it has the effect of softening up that line. So you could soften it up by just moving those out of the way. Now I also want to create a little bit of a kind of a shoulder piece coming up here. So let's drop out of there, go back to our polygons, and let's select basically these pieces here. Let's do an extrude, and we'll just kind of pull those up. And I'm just going to kind of move it over a little bit. And then I want to blend it back down into the shoulder. So we can go to points, and I can select those points. There we go. And then you remember we found merge by going to vertices, so we could do that, or we could say Control V, merge, or we could say Alt M, merge, like that. I'll do the same thing there. And then we could take both of those and kind of push them back down and in. And if you want to manipulate these points a little bit, you can do that too. And that just gives us kind of a little bit of a shoulder piece up at the top. Okay, now we also want to create an opening here on the neck and also a piece that comes up along the back. But it's not going to be, it's going to cross the line of symmetry. So let's actually bake in the mirror. Okay, and so I'm going to turn off the subsurf visibility. Let's go to object mode. And so we've got the mirror applied here. What we want to do is we want to actually apply it. So that's going to remove the modifier, but it's going to bake in the result of that modifier. So if we hit apply, you can see now we can go back to our subsurf, and that's great. But now when we come in here and click on these, you can see it's not doing the same thing over on the other side. So now we have actually a whole piece of geometry. So let's come in now along the back of that geometry, and I'm just going to select a couple of edges here. So let's select these, and I'm just going to scale these out a little bit. Let's select these edges, and I'll just move those down a bit. Now I'm going to select these polygons. Let's do an inset for those. So something like that. And then let's just extrude these out. And then using the S key, we'll kind of scale them down a little bit. Now I want them to be nice and sharp there. So let's use our Control R, loop cut and slide, to really tighten up those areas. Kind of do the same thing here and down there. And if you have a flat face like this that you need to add that to, inset is going to be the thing that you want to do. So come back in and select those polygons. And to get that edge on this side, we'll just hit I to inset, Drag it in a little bit. And there we go. So let me turn this back on. You can see, we go to object mode, you get that nice flat piece coming off. Okay, let's do the same thing up here on the top. So we want to add kind of an area for the neck. So we'll just grab these polygons in here. We'll do an inset, kind of like that. If we want that edge to be sharp, we already have the loop here, so we can actually add that later. We'll do an extrude, and we'll just extrude this down in. Doesn't really matter as much how far. If you want a rim, we can select these faces up at the top and extrude those up. Control R will allow us to come in and start to tighten up those lines. And then you can start to see the result there where we have this sort of opening up at the top for the neck. All right, so experiment a little bit with, adding little insets like that and little pieces that are raised up. Just keep in mind the closeness of the edges is going to determine the sharpness when you do the smooth. So you can see here that's very, very sharp. That's just because those edges are really close together. Whereas here it's not as sharp because the edges are a little bit further apart, or you don't have as many edges. Maybe you just have two. But if you have three that are really close together, you're going to get a really sharp edge. Okay, so some things to think about when you're building your models here in Blender. So the next thing we want to do now is start to block in the shape of the head. So let's go ahead and do that next. Now let's block in the head of our robot. So after blocking in the body and creating the body, we're going to do the head the same way. So how would we do it? Okay, we're going to bring in a cube, size it the same way, and we're going to break it apart so that we can use that mirror modifier just as we did with the body. So let's, in object mode, go to create, and I want to make sure that this cube goes where I want it to go. And so if I come in here and place my 3D cursor right over here, it's going to be in about the right spot. And so let's bring in our cube. Okay, now the location is off a little bit, so I'm actually going to set that value in the X to be 0. And let's also in the Y set that to be 0. Oops. If you get off on your right, there you go. You can always hit 3 to go back to the right-hand view. All right, so you can see here, you can sort of move it. By setting that to 0, we're just popping it to that origin. So let's kind of scale it out a little bit. And we'll scale it up in the Z. So just kind of getting the overall shape. Now when you smooth something, it's going to tend to lose a little bit of volume, and so you can kind of overshoot a little bit when you're sizing up your geometry here, knowing that you're going to be smoothing it. Let's size this up a little. So something like that. Now I know that we want to cut this in half, so we want to go ahead and go to edit mode. We'll drop everything, hit Control R, and I just want to come in and add that edge to the center line there. So go to polygons, and we'll just drop it and double click right in the middle there. Okay, now we can get rid of those extra polygons. Again, I usually tend to delete the screen left side or the character's right side. I'm not sure why I choose that side usually, but you can choose either one if you want to. You just have to make sure to set your axis correctly for whichever one that you do. So let's choose, and let me go to, let me actually maximize that, and then we'll switch this over to wireframe. And then I'm just going to drag across here using Control left mouse button and X to delete faces. Now let's go back into object mode and we'll add a modifier. Let's add a mirror modifier. Okay, and then we can also add a subsurf modifier as well. And then we'll increase our divisions a little bit. Now you can see it's a big blob right now, so we know what we need to do to flatten this up, right? We need to go in and start to add some edges. So let's go back into edit mode. And we know that we want the front to be fairly flat, right? We want the front to be flat this way, and we also want the bottom to be kind of flat, okay? And so we can come in here, Control R, we'll click and we'll drag this down to kind of flatten out the bottom there. So something like that. And then let's also do the same thing on the front. So kind of bring this towards the front. So we get something like that. You can hit 3 to go back to the right-hand view, and we can see how that matches up. So matches pretty well. Now you can see here that this is actually not matching up as well. So you can see the lines that we have here, and also here. So right here. And so let's go ahead and add another line right in here. Kind of like that. And let's do the same thing on the side here. Now, aside from the position of the lines, you can also, to change that softness, you can actually move the points, if you want to. So you can see here I'm moving this, and it's kind of changing the softness of the edge, but you can also actually move the points. And so if we go into our wireframe, go to points, you drag across here, you can start to move these points if you really want to get an exact match. It's not as important in this case, but it's a combination of the position of the edges in relation to one another, and also the position of the points. And so if you need to, you can come in and do that. I don't think it's that important that it match exactly, but if you want to get that curvature matched up exactly, then you can come in here and begin to manipulate those points a little bit more. All right, so let's take a look at this. And let's go back to solid. And so you can see we're starting to get the shape of the head that we want here. And again, we're just using a mirrored workflow so that any of the work that we add, for instance, on the mouth and eyes and things like that, will be symmetrical, will be mirrored over to the other side. So in the next lesson, let's start to add the topology for his little slot type of a mouth that's going to kind of curve around to the side, have a little bit of a permanent smile on his face. So we'll go ahead and start to add that in, and then continue to just detail the head a little bit before moving on to the neck and some of the other pieces. So let's go ahead and do that next. Now let's create our character's mouth. So the mouth is kind of just a slot that's going to happen across the front of the face and also kind of curve around to the sides. And so let's start to add some geometry in here to be able to do that. We'll start by just hitting Control R, and I'm going to click and drag a line right down, right around the bottom of the mouth. We'll do the same thing again, and let me drop out of that. And then we'll drag it right down, kind of right above there. Okay, now we want to define this area where the mouth kind of goes up. So again, Control R to do that, and let's define both sides of that. Okay, so we end up with something like that. And I want to do one more to kind of cut off the end of it. And we'll kind of pull this down right about here. Okay, now you can see that the position, or the kind of the shape of the mouth, is a little bit different on the front. And so let's add one from the front. We'll kind of do it right here where that seam is, which we'll use in a minute. And then let's do one more kind of right in the middle here. Okay, now let's take those polygons just on the front, and I'm actually just going to take this one in the middle, and I just want to move it down a little bit. So something like that. So just getting that kind of shape built in there. So one thing that we will want to do is to take all these polygons that are included in this mouth, and do an inset on those. But when we do that, it's going to create a little bit of geometry here in the middle. So we could think ahead and say, okay, well, actually I can do this after we bake down the mirror, or you can just take that into account, say, okay, I know there's going to be an extra polygon in here that I'm going to have to delete. Let's actually just do it after we do the mirror. So let's take a look and see if there's anything that we want to create that's symmetrical before we bake the mirror. So anything that we're going to want to have on both sides. And looking at this, I think this seam is one thing that we're going to want to have on both sides. And so we can do these seams in a couple of different ways. The way that I'm going to do it is I'm just going to take the seam. So I want to select the edges. So I want to select all these edges. So let's actually go to select edge loop, and that'll select the edges kind of all the way around there. Okay. And I want to do a bevel. So hit B to bevel. I'm sorry, Control B to bevel. And I'll pull this out a little bit. And I don't want to come out very far, just something like that. Okay. And then let's do an extrude. And you can see if I just do a regular extrude, it's not really giving us what we want. We want it to be pushed in all the way around the surface. And so let's undo that. And I want to choose a particular kind of extrude. So instead of hitting E, we're going to hit Alt-E this time. And you can see it gives us an option for how to extrude. So we don't want to extrude the region. We want to extrude the region using the vertex normals. So let's extrude the region vertex normals. And you can see here we can actually push it into the surface a little bit. So if we can kind of tell the difference there. So I don't want to push it in too much, maybe something like that. Okay, and you can kind of see that seam show up over here on the right hand side. If you want to sharpen it up, you can just add an edge, another edge on that side. Okay, so once we've got that, let's go ahead and turn off our subsurf. And once we're sure that we've got everything that we want to be symmetrical baked in there, we'll go ahead and apply the mirror. We want to make sure we're in object mode before we do that. Okay, we can turn this back on. And now we're ready to actually create the mouth area. So let's turn this back off, go back into edit mode. And then I just want to select those polygons. Okay, and I'm going to come in here, and you can see that we actually have a few in here that we have to select. So just make sure we get all of those. And then all the way across. It'll just end in the exact same spot on the other side. So come over here. And I want to have a nice edge around this. So let's do I to do an inset. And I don't want to inset it that much, just barely inset. So something like that. All right, and let's actually just do a regular extrude. I'll push it back a little bit, and then I'll also go directly to scale, and I'll scale this back a little. So we can tweak the scaling of that instead of doing it along the normal. And that gives us this kind of mouth opening. Okay, and if you want to really tighten it up, Control R, and we'll add an edge right in here. And let's add one in the center as well, kind of closer to the inside there. Let's take a look at what that looks like so far. So going back to object mode, you can see here we get the little mouth coming across. Now you can see on any of these places that are a little bit soft, those need extra edges. Same thing here. So all you have to do at that point is add an extra edge right in here, anywhere you want a sharp corner, and same thing in here. And it can either go that way or it can go up around. All right, so that's how we can start to add the mouth and kind of the seams along the front. So just if you want to add a little bit of detail to that, go ahead and do that. But the next thing that we're going to do is to go ahead and start to create the neck. So let's do that next. Now let's add a neck for our robot. So we need something to connect up his head with his body. So let's add a sort of cylindrical neck, and we'll add that using a separate piece of geometry. So we'll make sure we're in object mode so that the new object is added as a separate piece. The 3D cursor is right at the origin, which is where I want it. Let's go ahead and add a cylinder. Now we can come in here and change the values on this. So your vertices may be set much higher. I'm going to go ahead and set mine down to, let's set them about 12 or 8. So something fairly low res you can see here. Okay, we can also change the radius up or down. I'm going to make mine kind of, we can change it later, but I'm going to set it to about 0.2, 0.25 or so. And then the depth will just make it a little bit shorter. As far as the cap goes, you can either choose an N-gon or triangle fan. In this case, I'm going to choose nothing to just make that open at the top. So you don't really need the top or bottom because it's going to be penetrating into the head, and then the bottom is going to be going into the rest of the body. So once we've got that, we can start to move that around. So we'll move it up to the top here. And let's scale this a little bit. So I'm just going to scale it down a bit, scale it up in the Z, and I just want it to fit kind of inside of this space that we've got here. So maybe something like that. Keeping in mind that we are going to be smoothing this, so it will lose a little bit of volume. Okay, now let's turn off the visibility on the body and the head. We'll just work with the cylinder. Let's go to edit mode. Now you can see that we don't have, a lot of resolution coming in from the top to the bottom, so there's really no way to add any of that detail. We want to be kind of raised off. So what we want to do is add some resolution here. Now we could do it one at a time, or we could go ahead and select an edge ring. So go to select edge ring, and we select all those edges, and then let's go into mesh edges, or you can hit Control E to bring up the edges menu there, and let's do a subdivide. Now the number of cuts, let's increase that number of cuts until we get, maybe something like that. So maybe 4 or 5. Let's actually go up a little bit higher. Let's make it 6. Okay. Now let's go ahead and deselect all those. Now we can select the faces here. So I'm going to go to wireframe, and I want to make sure I've got faces. And let me just Control select. And I'm just going to do alternating rings here. So once we've got all of those selected, let's go ahead and hit Alt-E, and then I want to extrude this region based on the vertex normals. And let's actually kind of push this in a little bit. Okay, now we do have some of these edges up at the top, some of these faces, that because we push these in, these are now kind of sitting out on their own, and I'm going to just delete those. So delete faces, and let's do the same thing at the bottom. So kind of rotate around and select all those. You don't have to do that, but it kind of cleans it up a little bit. All right, let's take a look at what this looks like with subsurf on it. So go ahead and add a modifier, subdivision surface, increase that, and we get something that looks like that. Now, if you wanted to take the inside loops there that we didn't get, the alternated ones, and bring those out, you'll get, this sort of shape here, and it'll be more of like a crease instead of a, one that's inset. They'll all be sort of outset, but you will have those creases. So depending on the look that you want, you can do it a little bit differently. Let's take a look at what this looks like. Let me grab it and pull it down just a little bit so that the interior one is kind of pushing in. And we could also kind of squish it down a little bit if we feel like we want to see a few more of those little bits. Okay, if you want to kind of thicken it up a little, you can do that, but I think it looks good from the back and then there from the front. So the next thing that we'll do is start to add some ears. So let's take a look at that next. In this lesson, we'll add some little mechanical ears to our robot. So we want to have these sort of antenna coming off, not like this, but they're stuck into these little bases here on the side of his head. And so let's create those. And so one way that we can do that is to snap them right to the side of this. And so let me go into object mode and edit mode with this selected. And I'm just going to select one of the faces on the side there. I'm going to hit Shift S and I want to say cursor to selected. So that's going to snap the 3D cursor to that face there. We'll go back to object mode. So now what I want to do is add a cylinder to the scene. So add a cylinder. You can see it pops in right on that cursor. So I do want to rotate it a little bit. So let me actually rotate it in the Y. And let's rotate it 90 degrees. Let's also make sure that it has a cap. So on this one, I'm going to go ahead and make it a triangle fan. And I'm going to reduce the number of vertices down to 8. So it's pretty low res. Let's also take the depth down a little. And I'll pull this out. And then we can go to another view and just kind of get it in the right position. So I'm going to pull it down this way, something like that. And then from the side, we can move it over a little bit. So something more like that. Let's scale it up a little. And let's scale it up to be sort of right outside of that larger diameter right there. Let's go into edit mode. I'm going to drop out of everything and I want to choose the points. And I'm just going to drag across these points. And I want to make sure that I can select through this. So let's go to wireframe and we'll select all the way through. And then I just want to scale down those points a little bit to match up with that smaller radius. So we end up with something like that. Let's go back in here, turn on solid, and then we can begin to model with this a little bit. So I really want to have just a little bit of detail in here. And so let's do an inset. So I to inset this. Let's hit E to push it in a little bit. And then I know that I want it to be nice and tight when we smooth it. So I'll hit I again to kind of pull this in. Hit A to deselect everything. Control R. And we'll go ahead and bring in some of these lines to kind of tighten things up. So we'll do one here. And another one right in here. And let's do another one right along the inside edge. And let's do one more right in here. We'll kind of drop out of that. All right, now I also want to do one on the inside. I also want to add an edge kind of on the inside there. You can see it sort of penetrating through. And so we might have to rotate things a little bit. Let's go ahead and add a modifier. So we'll add subsurf modifier on this, and we'll increase the number of subdivisions. And then I'm just going to use the move to kind of pull this out. And let's also sort of rotate it a little bit just so it's kind of right up against the side. The side's not exactly straight because of the curvature. And if you want to, you can come in here and just make sure that it's matched up. It looks pretty good. So we get something like that. All right, we can also come in here and add a mirror modifier so that it can go across the side. Now you can see here, when I do that without doing anything else, let me turn this off. When we do that, we turn off the body too and the head. You can see right now nothing is happening. We're not really getting the result that we want. Even if I take this and move it up, we're not really getting the result that I want. And so let me actually delete this. And I want to create a new object here. I'm going to create an empty. And actually, before I do that, let me hit Shift-C so that the 3D cursor is at the origin, and then I'll create an empty, and it'll be located right there. And I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call this mirror object. Okay, and so now what we can do is when we add our mirror modifier, so let's go ahead and add that again. When we add our mirror modifier, we can tell it to use a particular object for the mirror axis. And so we could say, okay, I'll click in here and I'll choose the mirror object. And now you can see that it's mirroring it using that axis. So it's putting it in exactly the right position. So now if there's any pieces on one side of the object that we want to actually copy over using our mirror modifier, we can simply use that mirror object as the mirror object. Okay, so instead of using its own axis, it's using the mirror object to mirror that over. So that's one way that we can kind of make sure that that's mirrored over to the other side. Okay, we can turn back on the smoothing, and you can see the smoothing's still there. All right, so once we've got those little earpieces there, the next thing we'll look at is actually creating the little antenna. And so let's take a look at that in the next lesson. In this lesson, we'll take a look at a couple of different ways that we can create the antenna for our little robot. So we want to create these kind of zigzaggy sort of shapes for the antenna. The actual shape, matching it up isn't really important. The idea, though, is that we want this cylinder to be sort of go back and forth and have this zigzag sort of shape. And so let's take a look at a couple of ways we can do this. The first way would be to come over here. We're in object mode, and let's just add over here from create, let's add a path. So it's going to create this NURBS curve down at the bottom. Let's actually kind of move this up. And I also want to rotate it. So we'll kind of rotate it to the side here. And let's move it kind of over to this side. Now we want to access the actual points of this, and so we'll want to go into edit mode in just a second. Let me scale it down a little bit so it's a little bit shorter. All right, let's hop over into edit mode. Now I'm going to grab the points and start to make a little bit of a zigzag kind of a pattern. Now you'll see that we are getting that zigzag in the orange, but you can see that the path itself is very, very smooth. That's because of the sort of interpolation that this NURBS curve is using. And we want to reduce that so that it follows along exactly with those lines that we're creating. So what we can do is go to object mode, and you can see that path there. And we've got that selected. Let's go right over here next to the wrench, to the little curve, and let's select that. Let's go all the way down to the bottom. And under the order, let's set this down to 2. So you can see as we reduce that, it gets closer and closer to that curve, to the points themselves. Okay, so that lets us get that little bit of a sharper curve there. Now we also want to have some geometry along this. So one way we can do this is still in this NURBS path area. Let's turn the fill to full. On the bevel, let's increase the bevel depth. And if you look at the end of it, you can see that it's a square, so let's also increase the resolution here. And let's increase that up to maybe 3 or 4. Okay. So you can see if we turn this to half, you can see it gives you a half shape, which may be useful in some cases. You can also the front, but we're just going to do the full for this one. Okay, and that gives you the little tube, and then you could put like a sphere on the top of that if you wanted to. Now another way to do this would be something that's a little bit odd if you've used other applications. So I'm going to create a cube. Now let's kind of bring it up here. Okay, and let's select some of the edges. So let's go to edit mode, and I'm just going to click on, let's actually just click on this edge here. I'll go to mesh, edges, oops. Now let's just subdivide that edge a couple of times. So if you look at the points, you can see all those points there. So what I want to do is actually delete all the faces. So let me select all the faces. Let me go into We'll just go ahead. I know I don't have most of them selected, but we'll just do it a little bit at a time. Hit X, and we'll say only faces. So we'll delete only the faces. We'll do the same thing over here. X, only faces. And you can see it's actually leaving the edges and points, which is a little bit strange if you've used other applications. A lot of times the edges will go right along with it. Okay, and so now what we can do is select particular edges and start to delete those. So we'll delete those edges. And I just want to basically get down to that last edge, the one that I subdivided. Okay, so we've got this one edge, or it's basically a group of edges because we subdivided it. You can see it here. But we can come in here now and kind of move this over. So it's really, we're working with some orphaned polygon edges without any polygons, which is interesting, kind of cool. Let me scale it up a little bit. And so let's do the same thing here where we go in and let's grab, we need to go to edit mode. Let's grab the points and start to make our sort of zigzag pattern. And if you want to, you can kind of move it up a little. Or maybe this one is a little bit shorter and maybe it's going the other direction. So we'll kind of do opposite. And we'll kind of pull this one out. So something like that. So we need geometry to flow along this edge. So one of the ways that we can do that is to add a modifier. So let's go to the wrench and let's add a, let's see, where is it? Solidify. And it's actually right above solidify. We want skin is the one we want. So we'll add skin. And then if we take a look at it, you can see there's actually geometry flowing along those edges, right? So you can see the skin modifier here. Now it looks a little bit thick right now. And so what we can do is actually go into edit mode and let's actually select all of the points. Hit Control A, and then we can drag to sort of scale those down in a way. And you can see that reduces the size of that skin. Now it's four-sided at this point. If you wanted to smooth it, you can go ahead and add a smooth to it. And you can get something like that. Okay, so a couple of different ways that we can add these sort of wire kind of shapes. And if you wanted to then go in and add like maybe a cylinder, or I'm sorry, a sphere on the ends of these, you could certainly do that too. Okay, so using a path and then also using just polygon edges, you can create that kind of an effect. And you could do it, if you had a cube with, you just deleted the faces, you could do like a cage kind of a look. It doesn't have to be an open wire shape like this either. So really, really cool. So the next thing that we're going to do is build the eyes for our character. So it's really going to give them a little bit more personality, I think. So we'll go ahead and do that next. In this lesson, we'll create some eyes for our character. So before we do that, let's take a look over here in our outline, and you can see I've finally got to the point where I've taken my own advice in naming the objects. It's probably a good idea to make sure to name things as you go. I kind of created 8 or 10 objects and then went back and renamed those. You can name them as you create them. That's probably ideal. Or you can go in at the end if you want to and just take a pass and rename everything. It's really up to you and what you want to do. Having things named out as you go probably makes your life a little bit easier as you go through the process of trying to select objects and figure out what is what. It can be a little bit easier if you already have names on those. So I've finally gone in and renamed those, so feel free to do that at this point if you want to. So for now, though, we're going to create some eyes here. So let's go into edit mode, and I'm going to select polygon right up in here. And I'll hit Shift S again, and I want to snap the cursor to selected. We'll go back to object mode, and then I want to add a cylinder in here. And I think I'm going to choose 12 for the vertices. And then I can also rotate it. In this case, I'll rotate it in the Y 90 degrees. So we get something like that. And for the cap fill, just to make things a little bit easier, let's choose N-gon. So we've got one polygon there. Let's go to the front. I'm just going to move it down a little bit. And so remember what we did with the ear? It's going to be very similar to that. But we've got a lot more detail on this one. Let's scale it out a little bit. So something like that. All right, now I want to select that face. So let me come in here. And I want to just select the front face. So we'll go to edit mode. And let me select the polygon on the front. Let's scale it down a little bit. Okay, let's take the whole object, and I want to scale the whole object down a bit and bring it forward and get that wide part right in there. So I think something like that. Go back to edit mode. And so now we want to create not only this outer rim, but we also want to create the inner part of the eye. So we're going to do some insetting and some extruding. So let's do it, and we'll kind of take my time, try to take my time and kind of follow along. Let's do it I to inset, and we'll inset it kind of like that. E to extrude, and we'll push it in. Okay. I to inset, E, and we'll pull this out just a little bit. E again, we'll pull this out a little bit more. Okay, let's hit E again, pull this out. Let's hit S to scale down a little bit. I to inset. So we start to get an indentation and then this little piece coming out here, right? All right, so once we've got the basic overall shape, Control R, and we'll start to add some support edges. Anywhere we want this to be sharp. Right in there. Let's do the same thing on the eye. I want it to be kind of have a mechanical look, so I don't want it to be too rounded off. Oops, let me undo that. We'll add it in here. There we go. Now, I generally don't want to have any N-gons in the scene, and right now we do have one. It just made it a little bit easier to select that. But what we can do now is draw some lines across this so it's not an N-gon anymore. Remember, we used the knife. Let's do that again. So drop out of this, hit K to go to knife, and it'll come across, straight across. Okay, and let's do the same thing here. Knife. And you can see it's cool because I don't have to stop here and then redraw. I can actually go straight across it, which is really neat. So I'll come down here and connect that up. And then you can see here we still have some N-gons, and so we can decide, do we want to go across this way or across that way. Let's hit K again. And let's just go across that way. And one more time down here. Just like that. Now we don't have any N-gons anymore. Let's take this object and let's add a modifier. So we'll add a subdivision modifier to it. Give it a little bit of smoothing, go back to object mode, and there's one of our character's eyes. Now I want to duplicate this, so hit Shift D, and then X will allow me to move it straight across over here. Then we can come into this view and create more of a kind of a wonky look by scaling this eye up a little bit. And we can move it around if we want to. So let's kind of move it in a little bit. This gives them a little bit more personality. All right. Also, if you want to kind of zoom in and frame on something, you can hit the period key on your number pad, and that'll let you pick pick a particular object to frame in on. All right, so now we've got the eyes built and we've eliminated those n-gons. The next thing that we'll do is build a shoulder socket. So we need a place for his arm to come out of. So let's do that in the next lesson. In this lesson, we'll create our character's shoulder socket. So anytime we're modeling in any application, it's always a good idea, if you're going to be building a new object, to take a look at some of the objects that maybe you've already built. And if there's something that you can use as a base or something that's similar, then feel free to use that. It doesn't really make sense to rebuild everything from scratch every time if you don't need to. So in this case, we want to have a little socket here on the side of the arm. And I think it's going to be fairly similar to what we have with the eyes. So I'm going to select one of the eyes. Let's just hit Shift-D to duplicate. I'm just going to move it off. And I want to go ahead and rotate this. And let's go ahead and rotate it this direction. And let me move up here, and I'll change this to 90 degrees. And then from the side and from the front, we just want to start to place this. And so let's jump in here. And then from the front, we can start to kind of put it in position. You can see that it's a little bit too large overall, so we'll kind of scale it down. But it's also a little bit too thin, and so we'll scale it out in the X just a bit. Let's now move it out a little and move it up a bit. You can also look at it from here in the side view, and we can move it back slightly. Get a little bit better idea of the size that we want to have here. So something like that. Let's jump back in here and let's move it right up against the surface of our body here. So it's not sort of overlapping. Now, I like the shape of this, but I maybe want to have this be more like a ball, and so not so flat on the end. So let's go into edit mode. And this flat shape is being created by the position of the points, and also this sharp edge is being created because we have these three edges here. So we can start to soften this up by getting rid of some of these edges. So let's choose edge. Oops. And I'm going to select one of those edges, and let's just select the loop. And if I hit X, I don't really want to delete the edges because that'll delete all that. What I want to do is dissolve the edges and the points. And so let's hit X, and we'll say dissolve edges. And you can see from the smoothing that there's still some points there. So let's hit X again and dissolve those vertices. Let's do the same thing here. So we'll select the loop, hit X. Let's dissolve the edge, and then also the vertices. Now we can select this one, and I can start to kind of move this back a little bit. We can also come in here and kind of scale it up a little to make this a little bit more kind of rounded off. And then if you want to select, go to point selection and select some of these points, we can grab those and start to make this a little bit more rounded off. Okay, and if you need to, you can kind of delete some more of those edges, but this will allow us to just kind of round this off. Now you could make this again from scratch and then put like a cylinder in there if you wanted to. That'd be another way to go about it. But sometimes it just makes sense to reuse geometry that you already have. Just remember, you can get rid of those edges, but you may have to get rid of the points as well. And you can do that by hitting X and then going to dissolve those. Let's create a little bit more detail here along this rounded part. So let's go back and select the loop. Let's hit Control B to bevel. And I'll just drag this out a little bit. And then with that still selected, let's hit Alt-E, region, and then I'm just going to push this in a little. We'll drop out of that and see what it looks like. So we get this little sort of division there. Just a little bit of detail. Now I also want to add a little bit of detail kind of coming down the bottom. And so to do that, I actually want to rotate this model a little bit. And so I'm just going to grab, instead of doing it in object mode, I'm just going to grab all the points. Let's go into wireframe and just select everything. And then I want to rotate. And I just want to rotate it a little bit, something like that. Now I want to go to face selection, select that face down at the bottom. And then I'll hit E to extrude, pull this out, and then just kind of move it straight down and back in. We could repeat that. Pull that down and in. And then I can just tighten it up by hitting Control R. I'll add one kind of right down here. Okay, and then if you want to tighten this bottom part up, you can do the same thing going this direction. And pull it in there like that. Okay, you can also add a division here and then do it down there so it's a little bit thinner. But I just want to have some sort of little detail that kind of sets that apart. All right, now if you want to create the other side of that, let's take this and let's rename it. So we'll call this robot shoulder. And with that selected, let's add a modifier. Let's add a mirror. And we'll use that same object that we've been using, the mirror object that we created, the empty. And so that allows us to really quickly create the other side. All right, so that gives us our little shoulder sockets. The next thing that we'll do is start to build the character's arm. So we'll take a look at kind of bending it a little bit, adding multiple edge loops at one time, and build that out. So we'll do that next. In this lesson, we'll create the character's arm. So this arm's going to be pretty simple, but I want to show you how you can create a little bit of a bend and also add multiple edge loops here. So let's start by, in object mode, just create a new object. Let's create a cylinder. And let's just move it up kind of into position on one side of the body here. Let's kind of rotate it, and I'm just going to rotate it 90 degrees so that it is kind of straight across there. And let's kind of move it down a little and just kind of put it in the middle of that joint there. We can sort of scale it down so it's sized a little bit better. We can come to the kind of front view and see that, well, that's a little bit too big and a little bit too long. And so let's actually go in and scale this down a little bit. So I want it to be maybe a little bit larger than the smooth version there. And we'll move it in. I think that's close enough for what we're doing. All right, so if we were to try to bend this right now, we go into edit mode. There's no lines there to be able to do it. And so you remember we used Control R, which is also, I come down here, this loop, cut, and slide. But we didn't use it to add multiple edge loops at one time, which you can do. So let's hit Control R. And remember, we get this little purple preview. But if we use our scroll wheel, I can actually increase the number of those. And so we can kind of dial that up. And then when we're ready, we click the left mouse. Then we can still move them, place them where we want them. Click again, and we've got all those edge loops added. So it's nice to be able to add all that together. We can also now come in and add a little bit of detail to the arm. So for instance, I could come in here and just select those like right around the elbow, hit Alt E, and just kind of move that in a little bit. Let's go back to solid. You can see that there. We can then come in and sort of add one there. Add one right in there, and kind of imagine what it's going to look like when you smooth it. If you want it to be nice and tight, we'll want to have a couple more in here. You can dial that up. and then move them around and get something like that. Okay, before we bend it, let's also add some detail to the end. So let's grab this polygon on the end. Let's do I to inset. We'll inset it a little bit. E to extrude it in. Okay, and then maybe another I and E to extrude that in. And now instead of leaving this end gone, since we're not going to see inside of here, I'm actually just going to delete this face. Okay, and then we can come in and tighten up these lines by using our loop. Same thing here. You can come in here and add a couple at one time to kind of tighten things up, and then maybe we'll just leave that kind of rounded. And then if you want to kind of close this in a little bit more, we can select the loop, and then we can just hit S to scale and scale that down. Okay, so now what if we want to bend this? Well, there's a couple of ways that we can actually bend it. Let's take a look at one of the quickest. So let's come in here to the front view, and I'm just going to place the 3D cursor right here at the base of the arm. I'm also going to select all the points. Let me go into wireframe, and we'll just select all the polygons. So something like that. And we're in wireframe, so they're all selected. Now I'm just going to hit Shift W, and that'll allow me to come in and bend this arm. And you can see it all depends on where I'm actually placing my cursor, whether I come all the way back here, whether I come up here. Okay, so I can kind of bend it down to the position where I want it. And let's actually bend it not so much, and then we'll rotate the whole thing. So now if we take this whole thing and sort of rotate it, that gives us a little bit more of the look that we want. And let's go back into solid. Hit period on our keypad. And you can see that arm located there. Now, if we want to smooth it, we can add a modifier to it. And where is it? There's our cylinder. Go up here, add modifier, add our subdivision. Now you can see it's really soft in here. The reason for that is that we still have a polygon on the inside of it. So if we were to turn off the visibility on the shoulder, be able to see that polygon in there, we can just select it, delete it. Now when we go back in and turn this back on, you can see we don't get that. All right, so Shift W will allow you to kind of bend your geometry. There's also a deform modifier that you can use, the simple deform, that you can use to bend your geometry as well. So once you've got your arm, you can go ahead and now mirror it over to the other side. And in the next lesson, we'll look at building a hand, and this uses a modifier that is actually really useful. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that next. In this lesson, we're going to build a character's clamp-like hand. So to build a hand, let's start with a simple cylinder. Okay, I'll bring it into our scene. And right now we're working with 12. I'm going to reduce that to maybe 8, something that's a little bit easier to manipulate. And let's scale this down a little. Let's also rotate it. So I'm going to rotate it in the X 90 degrees. And now I want to delete some of these faces. So let's go to edit mode. And I'm going to drop out and just delete the caps. So we'll delete that one. And let's delete that one. All right, and now I want to delete one of these other faces here. So I know it looks like we're starting to just eliminate the entire cylinder, but I really just want this kind of shell, and I don't want it to be totally completed. So let's go to the front view now. And you can kind of see the shape that we're going for here. And so let's begin to shape that using these points. So we're in edit mode. And grab the points themselves. Let's go to wireframe. Okay, and I'm just going to move these over a little bit. And let's move these down a little. And just start to create sort of the profile of that shape. Let's move this down a little here. Move this up. So, something like that. Okay, keeping in mind that we are going to be smoothing this. So if we take a look, that's what it looks like currently. Now I want it to be maybe just a little bit thicker. And so let's kind of scale this out a bit. Maybe something like that. Now right now it's completely thin, right? There's no thickness to this. We've created the shape, but there's no thickness to it. And so we can go in and add a modifier to add that thickness. So let's go to object mode. And I'm just going to rename this. We'll call this robot hand left. And let's add a modifier. So the modifier that we want to add is solidify. Let's add solidify. And within this solidify modifier, we can change the thickness. So we can make it a bit thicker until we kind of get the thickness that we want. And once we have that thickness, I'm going to apply the solidify. So now we have some actual geometry to work with. Let's go into edit mode, Control R, and let's add some edge loops here. Okay, so on this one, I'm going to go ahead and do it one at a time here, and then I'll move it over right into the position that I want. You can also test this out. Right now, if we were to smooth this down here would be a little bit soft, which may be what you want, but you can kind of take a look at it. So let's go to object mode and let's add our subsurface. So you can see this is what we get. And so you can start to figure out where you want to add your edges. So I know here I want to add one to kind of tighten things up. Same thing there. And I actually kind of like the fact that it's not completely hard. Like down here on the bottom, you can see it's curved off a little bit. So I think I'm going to leave mine just like that. Now we can take our hand and bring it up and over and put it into position here. Now looking at it here, I think I do want there to be a little bit more of a sharp line on some of those joints. Let's kind of bring this in. We'll have to scale it a little bit to get it closer. It's not going to match exactly, but that's okay. So we'll scale it a bit, and let's come back here and take a look at it. We also want to move it over more into position here. I'll scale it down just a little so it fits inside of there. So looking at this, I do want there to be a little bit more of a sharp line there, right in here. So Control R, I'll add a line here and here, and let's do the same thing down here. So add one right in there. And you can see closer it gets, the tighter that gets. So we get something like that. So it doesn't have to be exact, but I just wanted to show you the fact that you could create something flat like that if it makes more sense for you to do it for a particular object, and then use that solidify modifier to add the thickness to it. And then if you want to bake that in to the geometry, all you have to do is apply the modifier, and then you can continue modeling from there. So once we have the hand, the next thing that we'll do is build up a little leg for our character. So let's do that next. Now let's build our character's legs. So the legs are roughly cube shaped. Obviously they're a little bit longer than that, but we're going to start with just a regular cube. So let's bring in a cube. Now we can go into our front and side views and use those to build this cube up. So come in and kind of scale it a little bit, also from the side. This is where multiple views come in really handy when anytime you're building a model here in Blender. Let's move this up a bit, and let's also sort of move it over. And then just continue to shape this basic cube shape. We haven't added any resolution to it yet, but we will need to as we go through this process. Let's come in here from the side. All right, let's start to now add a little bit of resolution in here. So let's go to edit mode, and let's add some edge loops. So I'll just use the scroll wheel to add a few loops in there. So maybe something like that. And then I'm just going to come in from the side first and begin to shape this a little bit. So I'm going to go to wireframe. I'm just going to grab the points. I'm just going to kind of work my way down here. So assuming that we're going to be extruding this in, these points are probably in a pretty good spot here. Let's grab these though, and we'll move those forward a little. Same thing here. And let's actually drop that. There we go. Those are in the right spot. Let's just move them down just a little. Okay. Now we've got the kind of overall shape here from the side, at least. Let's go to the front view. The top looks pretty good, although down here at the bottom you can see they really should be tapered out a little bit more. So let's do that. Let's grab those points and we'll kind of taper those out. And let's do the same thing here. Okay, let's add an edge loop right in here. And on that one, we'll kind of pull this in a little bit. Now let's go to the side too and do the same thing here. And let's do the same thing on the bottom. Scale that in so we get a little bit more of that sort of taper there. Now on these ones on the top, you can see where it's not penetrating in like it should into the body. And so we can grab those points and let's actually just move it up. So move those up and in. Same thing there. And I want to move this one back a little bit, just so it's not tapering in like that. Okay, let's select these polygons right in here where we have that little inset. Alt-E, and then we'll push that in just a bit. Now, assuming that we're going to be smoothing this, we already know that we're going to need extra lines of resolution, so let's begin to add those. Come in here. Now there are ways of creasing edges in different applications, but by adding support edges, you're able to make this a lot more portable. If you were to take this into another application or move it down the pipeline, you know exactly what you're going to get when you smooth this, and you don't have to rely on having creasing values. Now, if you're just staying in Blender, then that's perfectly fine. We'll add one there. And right here, let's also get rid of the polygons on the bottom and on the top. Let me turn off the body for a second. We'll get rid of that. Now it's not going to be very square shaped when we add our modifier. So let's add subsurf. You can see it smoothes it out quite a bit. And so you know exactly what to do there. We just need to add some edges. And so you can kind of see what that looks like. Oops, let me put those kind of right in the middle. We'll do the same thing on the back. And that kind of squares things off a little bit. If you want to do it even more, you can do it kind of squared off on the side. So come in here and kind of square things off that way. Just like that. Go back to object mode. And then you can kind of match it up even a little bit better with the side and front, but I think it matches up pretty well. So the next thing we want to do is add our character's foot. So let's do that next. Now let's create a foot for our character. So I want to have kind of a toy-like foot. I want it to be kind of hollow. So let's start with a cube and let's use the same technique that we used on the hand. So let's kind of bring this over and just kind of scale it so it's kind of the right size here. So scale it down in this axis. Let's move it over. You can come to the side view as well. And so we'll just match up the basic shape before we start adding any sort of extra resolution to it. It's a good idea to kind of get it in a close position where you want it. You can see it's a little bit too wide, so we'll kind of bring it down a bit. And let's lengthen it out a little. So something like that. So it's in the, roughly the right position. Now I want it to be hollow. And so let's go to edit mode and let's grab that face on the bottom and delete it. Okay, now let's shape this a little bit. So I want to take this edge right here and just kind of move it back a little and also in a little, something like that. Let's go ahead and add a subsurface modifier to this. So you can see what that's looking like. Okay, so now we can start to figure out how we can shape this. Now I know I want the inside to be flat, so that means I need to start adding an edge right in here. And I'll move it over to the side. So something like that. Okay, now I also want a little bit more of a kind of a taper to it, and so let's select the just the points on the bottom. So we'll drop out of that. We'll select those, and then select these as well, and let's scale those out. So I'm just going to hit S to scale. So kind of taper that out a little bit so we get something like that. And we can start to tighten up the back end of this by adding a line right in here. So we end up with something like that. Now if you want to taper this part down, we can just select this point and just taper it down like that. Now right now there's no thickness to this, so we need to do the same thing we did with the hand. Okay, so we want to add a modifier. We want to add solidify. Let's move it up above here. and see what happens. So I'm going to turn off the subsurf. And I want to take the solidify and increase the thickness of it. So I'll make it a little bit thicker. And I also want to just make sure it has kind of an even thickness. Okay, and then there's our subsurf. All right, so let's turn this off, and on the solidify, I actually want to apply that. So we left the subsurface modifier, but we applied the solidify so that that's actually part of the geometry. Okay, and then I want to come in here and go to edit mode. I want to add a loop right down here, and then I want to take those polygons. I want to create a little bit of a kind of a rim around the bottom. So we can select those sort of all the way around. Alt-E, and then we'll just extrude this out the other direction. There we go. Something like that. We can turn our subsurface back on and see what that looks like. If you want to tighten up that little rim, then all you have to do is add those extra lines in there. Okay, we get a foot that kind of looks like that. And then you can kind of compare the size and position of it, and you may need to kind of scale it in a little bit. You can see it looks like it's a little bit too wide there, so we'll scale it in that direction. Move it over, and that looks a little bit better. Okay, but we got this nice sort of hollowed out foot. We'll talk about more about why I'm not applying the subsurf modifiers and why we're just leaving those. We'll talk about that in a couple of lessons here, but that's how we can create this simple sort of cartoon robot kind of a foot, or sorry, like toy robot kind of a foot here. That's this hollowed out plastic. All right, so the next thing that we want to do is let's build a couple of pipes coming in here inside these little openings just to add a little bit of detail before we finish this guy up. So let's go ahead and do that next. Now let's build some pipes for our character's chest. So let's start by thinking about how we want these pipes to look. And so we want this kind of a shape right in here, kind of an elbow shape. So let's actually just start by bringing in a torus. All right, so let's rotate this torus. And before I do that, I'm going to change the segments. So I'm going to take the major segments, and let's take those down to, not down that far, but let's take them down to maybe 18 or so. You can kind of see the resolution up here. As far as the minor segments go, let's reduce that to 8. It's going to be going around this way. All right, so I think that'll work. Let's bring this up and let's rotate it. And so I just want to actually rotate it 90 degrees. And then we'll move it forward. And we're going to have to scale it down a bit, so let's do that. And let's try to get it scaled down there. Let's bring it over here. And we're just looking at sort of the one section of this, and so we'll kind of get it in position. So I think something like that. And then we can start to eliminate any of the geometry that we might not need. Okay, so we go to edit mode, turn on wireframe, and let's just come around here. And we can start to get rid of some of these. If you need to, you can turn off the body there. That'll help a little bit. And now let's also get rid of anything. We'll stop at this one that's kind of straight across. You can see this line right here. Let's delete everything above that. Okay, now let's select those edges right at the top. And then you can actually extrude edges as well. So we can hit E to extrude, and we can start to pull those straight up. Let's add a line kind of right in here, and then one right below that to get that kind of detail that we see there. There and right there. So something like that. So we're able to use just kind of a section of geometry to get the part that we needed. Okay, let's take now these sections that we want to extrude out. Let's grab this one and this one. Alt-E, and then we'll just pull these out a little bit. Now we're going to be smoothing this, so we'll add some edges in here. Kind of like that. And you know, if you want to spread those out, you can just scale the edges out just like that. Do the same thing here. And then drop them in. And let's scale those up a bit. And then you can come in here and really just tighten things up. And let's take this and add our modifier. You get something like that. Now let's place it into our cavity here. We can go from the front and side to kind of match things up. And that just gives us a little bit more detail inside of that opening. Now, if you wanted to experiment and have a little fun with different kinds of little pieces that you can kind of put in here to add a little bit of detail, or gears and things like that, using some of the extruding that we've been talking about, feel free to do that and place those in there. And again, we've just built, just like with any of these other things, we built it on one side, and then you can use your mirror modifier to move it down over to the other side. So, you know, with that, come in here and add your mirror. Remember, we have a mirror object just for that, and we can use that axis to just pop it right over to the other side. We can do the same thing on the leg, the hand, the foot, arm, shoulder. We already did. Okay, so go ahead and mirror everything over that you've got, you know, any of the pieces that you built on one side, mirror those over. And then in the next lesson, we'll take a look at, you know, what we can actually bake down, what we might want to bake down into geometry versus the modifiers that we don't want to bake down as we finish this guy up. So let's go ahead and look at that next. In this lesson, we'll talk about applying the mirror modifiers to bake down our geometry. So let's take a look at our simple little robot up to this point. Now, a lot of these objects are being created with the mirror modifier. So we've got one ear, and you can see it's being mirrored across to the other side. Same thing with these little pipes and the legs and so forth. So at this point, we need to decide how we want our geometry to kind of end up. Do we want each arm to be its own separate object, or do we want one object that has both arms in it? So for something like the ears, we're probably not going to need to modify each one of these ears independently. So for these, we could probably have that as one object. So we'll select the ear, and you can see it has a subsurf modifier and a mirror modifier. Now, we don't want to apply the subsurf because that's going to bake in all of that high resolution detail. We still want to be able to go ahead and access that low resolution geometry. So all the subsurface modifiers, I'm going to leave on. But the mirroring, I'm going to go ahead and apply it. So let's just apply the mirror. We can still turn off the subsurf, but you can see now that both of those objects are within that single object without mirroring. So if I wanted to, I could modify each one, but they both exist inside of the object. So if I were in object mode, I'm working with both of these at the same time, which in that case is fine. So what other parts of our model can we do that to? So I think the pipes here are probably a good candidate for that. So again, we'll leave the subsurf alone. We'll apply the mirroring, which gets rid of that. Now they're part of the same object. Okay. Let's take a look here. The shoulders. We're not going to need to modify those independently, so let's take those and apply the mirror. Again, leaving the subsurf alone. Now, for the arms, the hands, the legs, and the feet, we probably want to have those as separate objects. So let's take a look at how we can do that. So we'll select the arm, and so we've got the arm left, and again, it has smoothing, and it also has a mirror modifier on it. So let's apply the mirroring. Okay, so we still have the ability to turn on high and low res. And so to separate this out into another object, let's go into edit mode. Okay, and I'm just going to hit P. And it's going to bring up the separate window here, and I'm just going to say by loose parts. So now you can see, we go back to object mode, that we now have this, we have this robot arm here, and then we also have this new one. So we have both arms, and so we can start to rename these, and so we'll call this one right. And then I'll just take this ending off, and so we'll call that left. So now we have two separate objects that we can work with. Let's do the same thing with the hands. So for the hands, we'll apply the mirror, go to edit mode and hit P by loose parts. And then we can come in and define these. So this would be the left hand. This would be the right hand. So I'll rename that. So that allows you to get the objects kind of separated out. We'll do the same thing here. So apply the mirror, edit mode, separate that into new parts, and then rename. And we'll do the same thing here. If I can get over there. Oop, and do that. Accidentally moving it around there. We'll call that left. Let's do the same thing for the feet. So make that, apply the mirror, go to edit mode, separate that out. And then this one's going to be the right. And then this one will be the left. So now we can have, separate objects for each one of these versus having them all, having, for instance, both hands in one object. Now you'll notice that when I select this hand, the pivot still is over here. So let's go into Object, and I'm going to go into Transform Origin to Geometry. And we can kind of fix that up. So any of these that we've kind of mirrored over, we can at least move that pivot into a little bit better spot. Pretty much all the ones just on the right-hand side. Okay, and should be good. So now we've got everything separated out. We've got each leg separate, each foot. So if we wanted to deal with those separately, we could. The things that aren't going to move separately from one another, we've got combined together. Okay, and then these eyes are separate. Everything else should be good to go. So the next thing that we'll do in the next lesson, now that we've got all of those mirror modifiers off, is to go ahead and set up our parenting relationship in the next lesson. So let's go ahead and do that next. Now let's finish up by talking a little bit about naming and setting up our hierarchy. So the naming itself, the convention that you use, is going to be something that's custom to what you're doing. It could be specific to a studio that you're working at, or it could be specific to a particular project, a group project that you're working with, something that you've all decided on. In my case, I usually will have an overall group that is named for that model, and then everything underneath will kind of follow along with that. So in this case, we have this mirror object, which is an empty that we were using to mirror. And instead of deleting it and creating a new empty, I'm just going to rename this, and we'll just call this robot. So it's that little sort of locator object down here at the bottom. And it's already at the base of the character, which is what I want, where I want this to be. So now to parent everything to this, I'm going to select the objects. I'm just going to shift click and select all of these. And for this guy, I'm going to go ahead and just put them all at the same level. If you're doing some sort of a complex character, then you're going to have multiple levels. But let's select our objects here. I'm just going to select all of them that I can here. And then I'll select the robot empty last, hit Control P, and let's just parent those. Now we missed that one eye, so I'm just going to grab the eye and drop it right underneath this object. You can see if I expand that out, it tells you that all that's located underneath there. Okay, so if I were to select that, I can now move my object anywhere I want because it's all parented underneath. And so what I have done in the past, and you don't have to do it this way, but usually I'll have like the top level will be named robot, and then anything directly under that will be robot underscore whatever it is. And in this case, if there's a right or a left, I'll also do it underscore left or right after whatever the name of that is. Okay. Now, if we were to have like a couple pieces to the leg, then it would be, you know, robot leg left piece A or whatever it would be. So you'd keep that prefix on the object. So you don't have to do it that way, but you do want to have a unique name for all of your geometry. You don't want there to be any sort of cube or cylinder. You want to have some sort of a name that lets you know what it is, because, you know, if you have a scene just with this robot, you know, you want to be able to tell what the different objects are. But imagine you had a scene with a bunch of these different characters in it. You'd want to be able to tell what those objects are. So make sure to name your objects appropriately, and also set up a hierarchy. Now, if you're, you know, for instance, like on these arms, if you are, let me turn this back on. If you're going to be, you know, animating this just by rotating it, you're going to set up a hierarchy, like this is going to be parented to that, and then this to that, maybe, so you can rotate it around. In our case, though, I've just kept everything kind of on a flat level within this robot sort of group. Okay, so it really depends on the complexities, is I guess what I'm saying. All right, so over the course of the last couple of hours, we've gone through just some simple modeling tools and techniques here in Blender. So assuming that you haven't had much modeling experience, you should kind of be a little bit more familiar with some of the tools that you're able to use here in Blender. There's a lot more available to you as far as the modeling tools, and even, you know, a lot of the modifiers we didn't really touch on. We just used kind of a couple. So, you know, at this point, you can kind of use this as a jumping off point and move forward with your modeling in Blender. But hopefully you now have a good kind of base to work from in Blender. Blender is a really powerful application, and it's free, so that's always a good thing. All right, so thanks for joining us on this introduction to modeling in Blender. We really appreciate it.